Hey guys, my name is Braden, and today we're going to be going over McCulloch v. Maryland. First thing to start with is the case background, which begins with the chartering of the Second National Bank of the United States, which was established by Congress in 1816 with the purpose of keeping tabs on the unregulated currency being produced by state banks across the United States, directly after a war at that, because, inflation's important. Now, upon the bank's chartering, many states questioned the constitutionality of this institution, with Maryland imposing a tax on all banks not chartered by the state, because they love being at odds with the national government, apparently. Now, upon approving legislation in 1818 to tax the Second National Bank for $15,000 a year, which I may add is essentially taxing the federal government. Like the leaders of this country. The state of Maryland was blocked by the bank's Baltimore cashier, James McCulloch, who refused to pay the tax. The state of Maryland promptly filed a suit to force him to comply. And so the battle went. First went the state court, which ruled in favor of the state of Maryland. Shock. Then he went to the Court of Appeals. They did the same thing. They told him to pay the tax. And McCulloch was about to, but his attorney said, "Oh, no you don't," and took it all the way to SCOTUS. When the case opened, there were several questions in place. The first being, does Congress have the power to create a national bank? In fact, there had been a first national bank, as would imply by the name of the second, but it was expired earlier in 1811 due to a lack of support by Congress. The second question about the Constitution in this case is, do states have the power to tax the federal bank? Again, this was not clearly laid out, as was the very concept of a national bank. There's nothing in the Constitution about that. But there is the 10th Amendment, stating that all powers not expressly given in the Constitution were left to the states, right? For the argument on each side, the state of Maryland argued that they had a right to tax any business in their state, to which McCulloch's attorneys argued that the national bank was a, quote, necessary and proper extension of Congress's powers to carry out their designated purposes, making it a federal institution that was not taxable. So let's see how Maryland fared with this case. Apparently it wasn't that great, because not only was the Second National Bank necessary and proper to fulfill Congress's enumerated powers, but Maryland also could not levy taxes on a federal institution, specifically in this case, the Second National Bank. And on top of all of this, the vote was unanimously in favor of this ruling, thank you John Marshall, with 7-0 and 1 absentee, as there usually is. The reasoning behind this case includes, first and foremost, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, called the Necessary and Proper Clause, or the Elastic Clause, which gives Congress the power to, quote, make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution, end quote, the duties of the federal government, which in this case included taxation and the regulation of currency. Therefore, not only was the bank valid and constitutional, but it was actually necessary, and probably wasn't going to go away. Marshall also noted, on top of this, that the 10th Amendment never gave states the liberty of deciding matters not, quote, expressly given to the federal government. The word expressly was missing from the 10th Amendment, meaning that the states got the scraps of whatever the federal government left behind with their newly found elastic powers in the regulation and carrying out of their duties. To put it in the words of Chief Justice John Marshall himself, quote, although among the enumerated powers of government we do not find the word bank, we find the great powers to lay and collect taxes, to borrow money, to regulate commerce. Let the end be legitimate, let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consist with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. Basically what he said is, if there's something in the Constitution that warrants the creation of such an institute, such as a bank with the purpose of regulating commerce and laying and collecting taxes and borrowing money, then by all means Congress is allowed to do it and create this institution. Now, the second reasoning for the ruling involving the no taxation policy established by John Marshall. If any state could tax a federal instrument such as the bank, they would then be allowed to tax any other federal agency that Congress decided to make. And of course that would be infringing on the federal government, which holds this thing called supreme authority over the states, and you can't really practice supreme authority over the states when they're hogging money off of you, now can you? This ruling comes from Article 6, Section 2 of the Constitution, which states that states cannot interfere with the federal government's execution of enumerated powers. This is known as the Supremacy Clause, and has to do with basically any federal law is the law of the land, even if the land doesn't like the law. Again, in the words of Chief Justice John Marshall himself, quote, that the power to tax involves the power to destroy. If the states may tax one instrument employed by the federal government in the execution of its powers, they may tax any and every other instrument. This was not intended by the American people. They did not design to make their government dependent on the states. Essentially what he's saying is that the states should be dependent on the federal government and not the reverse. Otherwise, it's a complete lack of power distribution in a federalist sense. Because the federalist sense gives most of the power to the federal government and the remaining power to the states. Once the states have the power to tax, everything's reversed. So the impacts on the case are very, very wide in expanse. The power of the Supreme Court and the federal government, with its interpretations of the Constitution and the amendments, was pretty vast, with Congress being given greater powers with the recognition of the necessary and proper clause to basically give them free rein to make any organization that could be found to be necessary and proper. Another thing this raised was the issue of states' rights, which was brought into question yet again, and would later lead to the Civil War and a lot after that. And the most recent example after that would be the Third Bank War, when President Andrew Jackson decided to dismantle the Second National Bank in 1832 in an attempt to give the money back to the states. But now on the other end of Andrew Jackson, the Supremacy Clause established in McCulloch v. Maryland aided in quelling the Ordinance of Nullification issued by South Carolina in 1832 in response to the Tariff of Abominations, which was created in 1828 and slightly modified, but not to their satisfaction. They tried to claim that it was a null and void tax because it was unconstitutional, to which Andrew Jackson stated that the tax was the supreme law of the land, and therefore could not be undone, so he issued a force bill to force them to pay the tax. In addition to these fairly early examples, many future cases used this established Supremacy Clause to pass universal legislation across all states, one of the most recent examples being same-sex marriage being legal, protectable by the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights in Obergefell v. Hodges, 2015. Now, something to remember this lovely case by Marky Mark. I know it's cringy. Believe me, that's partly why I chose this, but it's 2 M's, McCulloch v. Maryland. There's a lot of k sounds in it. So, and there's the Y in the middle of that phrase, which sounds a lot like a V. So whenever you think of McCulloch v. Maryland, think of Mark E. Mark. It's 2 M words in a row with a lot of similar consonants. And much more. If it helps me, I'm sure it'll help you. Have a great day.